Ready? Welcome everyone to this meeting of the Climate and Environment Emergency Executive Panel. Firstly, do we have any apologies for absence?
No, Chair, although we're expecting Councillor Stootley and Councillor Padder to join us.
Right, on time.
On cue.
Yeah.
And Councillor Padder will be joining us too later.
Great. Any declarations of interest? Take that as a no. And can we approve the accuracy of the minutes of our last meeting on the 28th of June 2022? Does anyone have any comments on those? And has everyone read them? So can we agree the minutes? Brilliant. So that brings us on to today's item, which is again the biodiversity strategy for 2022 to 2032 and the biodiversity development plan, but this time post-consultation, and members will be familiar from last meeting about where we left it. Am I handing over to you, Adam, to present this?
Yes, no, thank you very much. Joined today, thanks for Helen Chamberlain, who's the Head of Strategy, Engagement and Culture. Is that right? Phil Hunt, who's the Environmental Strategy Manager. Judith Davison, who's Planning Policy Team Leader. Is that right? Ben Spratling, who's a grad trainee, and he's working in the Environmental Strategy Team at the moment, leading on biodiversity. And Andy Summers, who's Head of Environment Services. So thank you to all of you for coming today. And they'll be able to answer more detailed questions, I'm sure. I'll just run you through my presentation. So firstly, in terms of the drivers for the new strategy and development plan, obviously we're gathered here today while world leaders are meeting COP27. That really underlines the critical, time-sensitive nature of this work. We're seeing a global and unsustainable loss of biodiversity. The Council did declare a biodiversity emergency in 2019 in response to this loss. Sorry, I'll put my mic on. And the government recognised this issue by publishing its 25-year Environmental Action Plan in 2018 and the Environment Act 2021. In terms of the evolution of the strategy and the plan, so we kicked off in November last year with an engagement event at the Halls, the big biodiversity conversation. We brought the draft strategy to SEEP in July, and then it went out to public consultation in August. Following consultation, some changes have been made to the strategy, and a development plan sitting below it has been produced. Next week it will go to Cabinet, so hence why we're bringing it to the SEEP panel today for pre-scrutiny ahead of that. In terms of our environmental policy statement, so under our environmental strategy as it currently exists, it's to protect and enhance biodiversity and habitat. And we're strengthening that wording under this strategy to create a city where biodiversity can sustainably recover and thrive, not only halting species decline, as we're legally obliged to do, but going further and faster than the government in increasing species diversity and abundance by 2030. In terms of the core of what makes up our biodiversity strategy, the main objective is to develop a nature recovery network which complements the national nature recovery network that the County Council, the lead authority for, attempts to go further and faster to meet our more ambitious aims. And as I set out in July, that nature recovery network will be comprised of existing and new nature cores, such as our nature reserves, such as our county wildlife sites. They're renamed from what they were previously known as hubs. In terms of interlinking those sites together, forming nature corridors and stepping stones to allow movement and interaction from wildlife between these sites, which are already rich in biodiversity. And we're also looking to create restoration areas where biodiversity can be restored, such as parts of our parkland where we have that opportunity. We aim to have the NRN significantly complete by 2030, as I previously set out, to not only bring about cessation in species decline, but also increase abundance and diversity by 2030. Moving forwards, in terms of other main objectives, a number of these were set out in the presentation I gave in July. I just wanted to draw attention to two new objectives which have come out of the consultation. One being to create educational opportunities. There was strong demand from this from the public consultation. And one for food production, that is as an ancillary objective. There was certainly strong interest and demand in stuff such as fruit trees coming out of the consultation. So the strategy will integrate with the Greater Norwich Green Infrastructure Strategy, which is being prepared on a Greater Norwich level under the Greater Norwich Local Plan. And as I previously explained, the National Nature Recovery Network, for which the County Council are the lead authority. So in terms of who it will consist of, so, you know, ourselves, we own 8 nature reserves, many county wildlife sites, our parks and open spaces, and our responsibility for many operations across the city. We also need to make sure that we're working with our strategic partners, the County Council, neighbouring local authorities, and the Norwich Fringe Project do a lot of work for neighbouring local authorities in Broadland and South Norfolk, managing a lot of their natural areas. And in organisations such as Norfolk Wildlife Trust, who have obviously recently successfully purchased Sweetbriar Marshes. But also the VCSE sector, residents, businesses, etc. In terms of how the strategy will be funded, we're looking at existing council budgets being managed intelligently, also looking to leverage funds from strategic partners, to secure grant funding from the government, from charitable bodies, and through the SIL mechanism, from private sector ESG funding, and this is really important, from the revenue that we'll gain from the minimum 10% biodiversity net gain policy, which will come in January 2024. I can skip that one. In terms of management of the strategy, so a biodiversity working group has been put together over the summer, which contains officers from all of the relevant departments in City Hall to break down that silo working and achieve a cross-cutting strategy working across the council. In advance of the strategy and in advance of the 10% biodiversity net gain obligation that's coming in, we've commissioned a biodiversity ecology baseline assessment that was put out to tender, and it's been commissioned from the Norfolk County Council Environmental Services Department, and that will feed into a picture of where we are currently and give us an opportunity over the course of the strategy to refer back to the baseline and monitor how effective our strategy and development plan is in action. Moving on to the consultation, so we've had a very high level of engagement. 1,076 residents visited the Get Talking Norwich page with the consultation on, and 295 downloaded the strategy as a PDF. We had 90 detailed responses on GTN, with a further 10 coming in via email. And 11 key groups gave detailed feedback, including the Norfolk Wildlife Trust, the Norfolk County Council Natural Environment Team, Friends of the Earth, etc. Overall responses were very positive. Over 80% either strongly agreed or agreed that the new proposed policy statement was sufficient. Over 80% strongly agreed or agreed that a nature recovery network is the best way to improve biodiversity. And over 90% strongly agreed or agreed that a portion of our parks should be rewilded. In terms of other themes that came out of the consultation, I've already touched upon the interest there was in education. 45% of responses touched upon that, and that's reflected in the post-consultation amended strategy. So sitting underneath the biodiversity strategy is the biodiversity development plan, which I appreciate you're seeing for the first time. This is the principal means by which the strategy will be developed. It's based on a rolling 3-year ahead horizon, and so it can flex and evolve according to conditions, opportunities and constraints. So the plan is structured according to thematic work streams. So these themes include planning, town and country planning, council operations, species and nature recovery strategies, biodiversity measurement, promotion of education opportunities, etc. In terms of the chronological structure of the development plan, this is set out in detail in the Gantt chart at the back of the agenda. But to summarise, the first stage is a communication and engagement stage, where we're going out and speaking to organisations to identify new nature assets for the NRN. Then moving on in next calendar year to the mapping and coordination stage, and we're mapping and prioritising those new and existing nature assets into a cohesive nature recovery network to ensure sufficient coverage to meet the objectives of the strategy. The stage also coordinates the local nature recovery strategy work of the County Council in identifying further opportunities to create, connect and enhance habitat. After this stage, we're moving on to the programme development stage, where action and funding plans will be developed specific to new nature assets. And moving on to that, an implementation period, which will largely be from January 2024, where new and existing nature assets will be created, connected and enhanced. Each task will have a nominated delivery agent, premised on action and funding plans developed by the task owner. The environmental strategy team will coordinate and report outcomes. And this last slide is just, and I don't propose to go through all of that in detail, but it's obviously at the back of your agenda. And I'm happy to take questions. And it is at the back of the agenda, isn't it?
Yeah, I can't read it. Also,
Did anyone read it?
it appears in the form of the table in the fact that the biodiversity development.
Sorry, I didn't realise how small the text was.
So we've reproduced it as a table. So you
Okay, thank you very much, Adam, for again such a clear and informative presentation. Do any officers at this stage have anything further to add or comments? No? In which case, I'll open it up to questions and comments. As ever, can we please have one councillor or point per member? I will come back round as many times as we need to, but hopefully more people will get a say and you'll probably get a better response if people aren't having to juggle lots of questions and points at once. So, Councillor Carlo first.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Yes, I want to start by thanking the officers very much for the enormous amount of work they've done over the summer and spring since the consultation. Really pleased to see the addition of the biodiversity development plan and also setting up a working party which is working across council and obviously the development plan, the timetable, looks very good. And I hope lots of tasks and milestones there, and I hope that very soon we'll start to see changes on the ground. And it's going to require a cultural change because I think for too long nature has been put in a box, but actually nature thrives in very messy places. So I think we're going to have to educate people to accept a bit more messiness in the city. I've got several questions, so obviously we can only ask one at a time. So my first question is, since the consultation and the CIS meeting, we've had the heat wave and the terrible drought, and we've seen the terrible toll that it's taken on a very fragile nature with fires on Mousehole Heath and loss of young trees and so on and so forth. And so much that's gone on unseen. Probably has been death of hedgehogs, and then there's been death of birds and so on and so forth. So my question is, what additional action will the City Council take in order to increase the resilience of biodiversity? For example, how are we going to ensure that young trees that we plant thrive in the future when obviously we're going to be faced with heat waves, especially given that tree planting is a key feature of adaptation. But if we're planting woodlands and they don't survive, then actually it's a bit of a difficult dire situation. So that's my question, but also my many thanks. So thank you.
I feel a lot angry with the party.
I think nature's kind of principal survival strategy is one of diverse diversity. So I'm going to answer around the kind of wider principles that apply to managing ecology through climate change. It's something that we take advice on through experts, but maintaining a diverse and possible planting strategy is one of the ways that we do that. And I also think it's been a very unusual year. We do expect more extreme weather, which may take the form of, drier summers, drier winters, wetter summers. And so by perhaps open planting, by making sure our planting schemes are very diverse, we will ensure the survival of sufficient numbers of trees and species that we choose to plant. So we're mindful of it. As the biodiversity development plan says, it reflects and evolve over time, and that's something we're very mindful of. I suspect that this year has caught us unawares, and it's our job to plan for such events in future years. We are expecting the weather to become more hostile.
Councillor Ludbrook, did I see? And then Councillor Champion.
I suppose included in your reply is the way that the Norwich Services Limited would work, or the environmental
Norwich
city services would work. I mean, just go past a tree, they have to go back and back and back to make sure that it is watered, which is one of the things that doesn't seem to happen at the moment.
They are party to the working group, biodiversity working group, and with our early stages, there is a good dialogue about how we work that.
My main question was about the UEA, and we said that they would review this strategy, and have they done so?
Yeah, well, Ben, do you want to speak about UEA's response?
We haven't reopened the consultation. I'm not sure if the formally respond. They are party to the climate nutrition who did provide a formal response, so indirect.
Phil, Jackie's just requested, can you move your microphone a bit nearer, if that's okay? Yeah, so we can hear you a bit stronger. Thank you.
It did say in the minutes that it was the intention was for the strategy to be reviewed by universities and academics through the consultation process, but they just didn't.
It was sent.
Okay, I think I had Councillor Champion next.
So, again, thank you for all the good work. You know, it's admirable. It's an impressive amount of work that, you know, my colleague, Councillor Giles, and all the yourselves have done. So I appreciate that. Specifically, I was wondering, for Mousehole Heath, for instance, Mousehole Heath over the summer has had a 90% decline in butterfly numbers. I was speaking to the ranger and the tree warden on the heath the other day, who were surveying the heath in relation to heat death from the trees. I was walking around at my ward and some of the neighbouring wards over the last couple of weeks, and just as an example, in Heathgate, there are a number of dead trees, and when I was working and talking with a ecologist independently, he was very critical of how Norwich City Council plants those trees, which indicates that we need to think about how, you know, the education of our own services, and that there are a number of trees which are, the tree ties are plastic and they're strangling, I've forgotten the technical word for that now, but they're garrotting the trees, for lack of a better terminology. And so, in that regard, when we talk about education, obviously the first people we need to make sure we're educating the people who are under our own employment, and is there a timetable to do that, so that we can ensure that any implementation of strategy is to the best effect?
The timetable is set out in the development plan, which is set out as in quarter-year chunks, granularity. And included there are there's detail about how those work streams will be rolled out. And I guess I'm referring to my earlier reply, which is the employees under our own management, NCSO included, are party to the development and over time, and actually moving quite quickly in NCSO's case. Certainly in the first 6 months of next year, we are planning significant changes to the way we work together. We welcome specific suggestions, such as the use of plastic tree ties, and I think that's something we need to look at.
Okay. Further questions? I'll come to Councillor Lubbock again if no one else is. Yep. Okay.
Can we make a few suggestions about consultations? I did notice that we've got lots of groups, where were they? But you didn't have Friends of Eton Party. Friends, I'm sure we've got Friends of other parks. We did have the Friends of Eton Park, and that's one of the first Friends that was started about 15 years ago. And they've already planted Little Orchard, they've planted a wild flower, that's right. And they've got quite a lot of information from the people that they've been working with.
So this will be in the schedule of interested parties. I can certainly confirm.
I'm sorry, yeah, I didn't see.
I think it's certainly not an exhaustive list.
Well, no, let's make sure
Yes,
they're in there,
absolutely.
because as soon as you start talking about rewilding parks, they're the ones that've got the communication skills. Not that we haven't, but right down at grassroots level, to talk to the people who use the park, the users.
Sure.
And Friends are very, very useful. I was a bit surprised that I didn't see them in there. And Hand Park, we've got a Hand Park, I'm sure we have Waterloo Park. There were 3 that I thought of at the time, and they weren't there anyway.
Just on the specific point about rewilding, we would do specific consultations with relevant people for each park, so we would certainly be reaching out to friends groups in those circumstances, but Phil might have the list up now.
Just to say, certainly intentional omission, we actually have a mailing list of about 90 green groups. So named in the strategy, because they actively reached out to us during the consultation process. We have, for example, Friends of John Wood, Friends of West End, Friends of Children, etc. Friends of Earlham Cemetery. So yes, as says, for anything specific regarding the park that they care for, we will reach out to others. This list was formed primarily from responders, but we do have more confidence in this list.
Any questions, especially from those who haven't asked yet, before I come back to Councillor Carlo? No, okay, Councillor Carlo.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'd like to raise biodiversity net gain in new planning permissions, please. At present, the Act, the Environment Act refers to 10%, and then the DEFRA regulations consultation refers to at least 10%. And the DEFRA consultation says that 10% will be a mandatory requirement, but should not be viewed as a cap on the aspirations of developers that want to voluntarily go further, etc. And so some local authorities, for example, Cambridge, Lichfield, Swindon, Guildford, they've adopted the ambition of 20% biodiversity net gain. And sorry,
How much percent?
20%. They've adopted an ambition of 20%. And I suppose I'd like to encourage the City Council to look similarly at a higher target. And I see that the Council, and I'm pleased about it, is going to produce a sustainable planning document on biodiversity net gain. And hopefully the target can be reviewed there, because obviously the 10%, at least 10%, doesn't impose a cap. But I think there's a good case for having a higher target than at least 10%, because the population of Norwich has grown in the last 20 years by over 20,000, and that's the city of Norwich. And that's been done by intensifying development, and so Norwich is now the fourth most populous local authority in east of England. And in developing, growing Norwich, there's been loss of habitat, not designated sites obviously, but some commonplace habitats like parts of school playing fields or odd corners of long grass and so on and so forth. And I would say that there's been an overall loss of biodiversity in the city. And so in raising that, the comment comes back, well, there's an issue about developer viability. But I think that actually developers need educating, because they used to say that with regard to increasing the thermal efficiency of homes. They would say, oh, you'll never sell homes with solar panels or with a passive house, for example. But actually now the market is demanding that sort of housing. And some of the biodiversity measures are very low cost. For example, installing a swift brick is low cost, as is, for example, putting in a hedgehog highway into a fence. That's a low cost. And obviously then we've got much higher cost biodiversity features at the other end of the scale, like green roofs and walls. And obviously that would be for larger developers to look at. But some of the brownfield sites in Norwich, for example, Angry Square, just take that as an example, haven't got any biodiversity on there at present. And so actually having a markedly big increase in biodiversity could mean lots of small measures on the site. But also, as we've been intensifying Norwich, the development sites, for example, we've got more apartments in Norwich, people need somewhere to go to relax, and so having green spaces they can go to as opposed to sitting on hard paving is really important for people's quality of life. And so I'd like to argue for a higher percentage than at least 10%. And just to say that I noticed that in the strategy there are 2 references to at least 10% biodiversity net gain, but there's also a reference in the strategy itself to just 10%, and so obviously I think that would need amending.
I'm sorry, that was question.
Yeah, in the strategy there's 2 references to at least 10%, but there's also a reference at some point to just 10%, so that would need, that's going to need amending. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Just to respond to that question about the 10%, our Greater Norwich Plan emerging policy says at least 10%, so we haven't set a cap on it. We're being positive that it could be higher than 10%, and we'll wait and see how that develops. And obviously, we're doing this baseline study that's about to commence next week, so we can understand what our baseline is that then we'll be adding to, and the features that we need to address in particular. So we'll be doing a lot of preparation over the course of the next year to support the introduction of biodiversity net gain. We'll know a lot more as well about what we're required to do when the guidance actually comes out, which hasn't so far yet. But yes, I just want to stress that we're not placing a cap on it being just 10%. And I'm aware that some of the districts have got a higher percentage. We do, as you said, you alluded to the issue of viability. We do have to have an eye to that as well, because there are other things that developers have to provide, like community infrastructure levy, the RAMS tariff, etc. So it's something we need to bear in mind. But we do want to be ambitious where we can about biodiversity net gain.
Okay. Any further questions? And also, got Councillor Maguire here as well, who we're told, as Lord Mayor, can actually be ex officio at any meeting. Jackie, did you say Kevin could ask questions if he wanted, as far as we're aware?
Chair, I imagine that's at your discretion.
If that's at my discretion, Kevin, feel free at any point then, although obviously you're not a voting member. And in the meantime, I did see Councillor Champion.
And some of our, so we had some discussions prior to the meeting. I've been trying to bend my head around all sorts of policies. And one of the things which is highlighted in here, it talks about, for instance, green roofs specifically, that that the existing buildings owned and managed by commercial entities contributing on a voluntary basis. It talks about green roofs and other things that people can do, balconies, back gardens, green areas adjacent to buildings. And the policies seem to not weigh in favour of biodiversity, that heritage and other factors seem to have a higher weighting when it comes specifically to planning. I think that's how I interpreted my, when I was sort of reading through that or trying to get my head around that. I don't know if that's a fair analysis. So that sometimes on planning, when there is a opportunity for higher levels of biodiversity, these are weighed against other policies, such as heritage policies, and therefore discarded. And obviously, we don't have a heritage emergency, we've got a biodiversity emergency. So I was essentially wondering, are we going to be flipping that? Is biodiversity then going to become one of the primary policy considerations when it comes to planning, so that we are not weighing, so that becomes equal weighting to heritage? And I'm using heritage repeatedly there, but as an example, if that follows, that makes sense.
Well, at the moment we've got the National Planning Policy Framework, which we have to take into consideration as well, in relation to net gain. So that requires a measurable net gain for biodiversity. So at the moment that's what our office will be trying to achieve on a case-by-case basis. I know that I think we discussed with a colleague last week about sometimes there's relative trade-offs exactly, but there different ways that will be given to different aspects, very much on a case-by-case basis. But I think moving forward, the direction of travel is we will have a mandatory to produce this biodiversity again on a mandatory basis. So that's something we're going to have to do for every application that's appropriate. So it's impossible to set the stage about relative weight to different issues, but that's something we're going to have to produce and provide evidence that we're be able to report on that, to be able to monitor the enhancements that we produce. So as I say, this is a new system we're working towards now, and in about a year's time it will be in place. So it will have a higher, we will be able to achieve more under that new system for biodiversity.
Thank you. Can I respond to that?
Yeah, if it's in response to that.
Well, in relation to, so again, it talks about back gardens and green areas adjacent to buildings, which brings to mind education. One of the things which we've got increasing, it seems to be exponentially, is AstroTurf, paving, and people doing decking across their back gardens and front gardens. There's not enough parking in the city, so people are concreting their front gardens so they can park their cars there. One of the things which is being highlighted to me is that during the drought on Nassau Heath, as an example, basically you had a flight of insects which then couldn't access water, and hedgehogs and bats which couldn't access food, water, and so they then moved out into the sort of surrounding areas. And my concern is in the surrounding areas, and it's anecdotal, but it's something I've observed, is we've got this increase in the amount of loss of biodiversity in people's personal spaces in their back gardens, and I know that doesn't fall under planning. But how can we encourage, if we're talking about biodiversity corridors, how can we encourage and promote and create wider biodiversity in people's personal spaces through, what mechanisms are we going to, because obviously we can't just be focusing on the parks and our wild spaces. We need to be looking at, if we're talking seriously about biodiversity corridors, that includes people's gardens. And how are we going to communicate this with people effectively?
I can reply in terms of communications and engagement strategy, that we will be preparing communications and engagement material to encourage, albeit on a voluntary basis, people to improve biodiversity in their backyard. That's how we will do it.
May I offer a suggestion?
If it's a quick one, yes.
A quick suggestion would be in a similar way to how certain businesses stopped doing fireworks because they understood the danger of fireworks. Possibly we could approach local businesses and ask them to stop selling AstroTurf, and maybe to highlight to people when they're buying decking that maybe there's alternatives. Maybe go to the source and help, work with those larger businesses to educate the businesses themselves.
Thank you.
Okay, noted. Further questions? Councillor Lovick.
Can you just explain to me what we're going to do in the interim between now and, is it January 24 when we get 10% going in as a legal requirement? What we're going to do with regard to planning applications that come before us that don't have any sustainable drainage attached to them, we can be sure that they have green roofs and waterworks.
We, as I say, the National Planning Policy Framework already requires 10%, doesn't require that percentage, requires a measurable net gain for biodiversity for planning applications right now. So that's already been applied through the planning application process. But that will change then whenever the legislation is introduced to at least 10%.
But that's, we are seeing developments come before us. In fact, we had one, it was an extension to the police station, and we couldn't do a thing about it to put any green infrastructure there, not even plant a tree. And so, the frustration that we felt in that meeting, we're going to feel for another year or so, because we have no authority to say you should make this to some extent green what it is now. And it's pretty bad now. There was nothing. Were you at that meeting?
I was.
Was that a fair summation?
I think that's the best.
Yeah. And do you feel also that, regardless of this, that we're going to have a year of, more applications like that, where we are hamstrung and can't, say, what about, we want to see a green roof there, we want to see more trees and things like encouragement that we, despite this, that we have got something.
Well, I can pass that back to my development management colleagues actually, but we did just sort of have a little meeting the other day. I think that came up in that meeting, didn't it? And one thing that we've agreed to do, at least through the planning application reports, is to include a summary of how biodiversity net gain has been addressed for individual applications. So it will make it explicit, because at the moment it's not explicit in the committee reports, planning applications committee. So I think that's helpful, and that'll help folks' minds, I think, a bit more as well.
Okay, anyone else? Any Councillor Skewby?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm not sure if this can properly be answered, but I've always struggled to quantify in my own mind the 10%. I wondered how you, if you can describe how that's calculated and give some examples of how a 10% net gain would be met on a typical application, please.
I'm not really sure that I can. All that I can say about it, because I don't deal with planning applications myself, but there is what's called a metric, a DEFRA metric, that is used to work out the baseline, and then what particular measures, how they're measured and how they're classified, so that you can work out approximately what percentage sort of increase in biodiversity is delivered through a particular planning proposal. But I'm afraid I can't provide you with detail on that. It might be that we get some of my colleagues to give you further detail, but maybe feel
A little bit more, I think. I think the net gain metric is premised, as is the strategy, on habitat creation. So the strategy is very much focused where habitat is created and maintained, species will follow. Will come. And so the biodiversity net gain metric is based on a set of sort of system of valuing habitat using a numerical system and the area of the habitat that is being lost, so that it can be replaced in habitat terms on site or off site plus 10%. So I think it's something that's actually pretty straightforward, but there is a practitioner group that's set up to kind of manage the skilling and knowledge development around that, and it's becoming and will become, before it becomes mandatory, pretty standard practice for local planning authorities. There's a recognised methodology.
Okay, thank you. So you say that it's straightforward. Is it going to be straightforward enough for applicants to understand going forward?
I don't see this barrier.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Opening it up again. Councillor Carlo.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm really pleased to see that the City Council is playing a leadership role and will encourage a large number of partners to hopefully address biodiversity on their estates. And in the list of interested parties, I wondered if there were a few missing public bodies who have land holdings. One example is the Norwich Hospital, for example, which has quite a large land holding. Another one is the prison, and also Andean Water in Norwich. But another party that I wanted to raise, and it may well be that it is addressed in the strategy, are private landlords, private residential landlords, who rent out a hell of a lot of homes in Norwich, and they go for easy maintenance. They rip out the hedges, they put in wooden fencing with concrete bases, they put down paving, because they want an easy life. And somehow we've got to get them on board as well, to create, well, as Gary has said, that private gardens are so important for biodiversity in urban areas, given the huge losses that we've seen in the countryside, which I hope will be addressed through the environmental land management scheme to some degree. But I don't know in the strategy under on page 10, yeah, 10.1, and a list of potential hubs. Under K, it refers to existing buildings owned and managed by commercial entities. I wasn't sure if that included private landlords or not, but I certainly would like to see engagement with the landlord in some way.
Yeah, that will be included in the comms and engagement plan as that evolves. There is no entity excluded from the biodiversity strategy.
No, that's right, I'm sure.
Maybe that's the form of words I should have actually used.
Yes.
So yes, no, we recognise that. I think, did you use the phrase culture change earlier?
Yes.
There is a culture change going on in society generally. Obviously, it also occurs within the lead institutions and organisations within the city, which is what's happening.
Yeah.
And we're also seeing that that change start to happen in wider society, and so it's very much our intention to kind of use that momentum to support our kinds of engagement activities. So yes, they are.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yes.
Councillor Champion, but just is there anyone else who's not commented or said anything wish to do so? No. Over to you.
Sorry, and I apologise because I feel like I'm asking a lot of questions. I feel like this, in all due respect, I think is one of the most important things which we can do, given that we are in an emergency scenario. Now that we know that the climate will go beyond 1.5 degrees increase, depending on what news channel you watch, I think there was very different gauges given on the media over the last week or so. But with relation to this, and I think one of the points it was making was talking about climate change, and I can't find a specific point now. But in relation to what we're planting, are we going to be planting in anticipation for the changing, for the increasing heat that we're going to be getting? Are we going to be, and I know there's different schools of thought on this. I've spoken to some different ecologists. Some of you are adamant that we should only be planting indigenous species. That that we should be, or are we taking a more sort of broader perspective where we're thinking about incorporating species that may be more Mediterranean or species that maybe are going to be more resilient to the changing climate? That's a fair question.
There are differing opinions, and we'll take soundings on them over the next 2 or 3 months, more so. I come back to what I said earlier, which is we're all here because of nature's strategy for diversity. And actually our current tree planting strategy works on diversity as well. So for me it seems to be almost common sense that as long as we keep things very diverse, then some species will thrive. And hopefully more than some. You mentioned dry summers. Well, next winter might be our wettest winter. We just don't. And so, yes, I think being very diverse is the way that we have to manage our planting. And I'm not keen on the idea that we maintain kind of native species approach. That would be my recommendation to the group. Perhaps a kind of, we have a maritime climate. We might be becoming more continental. Our climate might be more like that of the continent. So. A kind of a sort of nearby approach. I forget the full name for it, but it's where you plant species that exist within several hundred miles or up to 1,000 miles of your location. Is one of the tools that's evolving. And I'll come back to diversity key trees. There's lots of discussion about that. Consensus of the world where it will fall quite quickly.
Thank you.
I think it feels like we're coming towards the close on this, but I'll take another question or very short set of questions from each member. And I see Councillor Maguire, who hasn't spoken, is indicating, and then I'll come to anyone else who wants to.
I was waving the air, obviously.
Oh, sorry, you're right.
Don't worry, because I have to go in a few minutes. But look, I just want to make a few comments and don't ask, what do I ask? I think it's a serious question. Really, I think we must mark and understand just how important this is, the launch of this strategy. These things are really slow coming, and they take a lot of work, a lot of officer time, a lot of member time, take a lot of frustration on everybody's part, and bringing this together in this way, I think, it is to be commended. So on behalf of the citizens of Norwich, I extend my thanks for the work that everyone's done in making, in getting to this point. It's just wonderful, and I'm so pleased. One of the things when you develop a strategy is on the surface, well, so obvious, isn't it? It's kind of when you really peel it, the tea's got to and realise the implications, and that's all being done. So, yeah, well, thank you, everybody involved. Just a couple of quick comments. I'm really pleased with what Judith said, explains why planning insisted on a green roof and a small kitchen extension, but that's fine. Councillor Cole mentioned the prison. Interestingly enough, Sheriff and I visited the Norwich prison recently, and they are chomping at the bit. The residents and the officers, they've got allotments going there. They are busy planting trees. So any engagement, I'm sure you probably began engagement. If you haven't, get in there. They'll buy your hand for any help that they can give. Leading up to it, I was so pleased your closing sentence or point on the report mentions two things. One is you mentioned the Rio Accord and how we must balance that. For me, that holy trinity, the environmental, the economic, and the social. And again, Norwich will benefit in those ways from this work and working together with that. So, thank you for that. Coming to the point, or the question I was to ask is, because, and you're right to point out, carbon capture, the role of biodiversity in carbon capture. I'm just wondering, I'm not expecting an answer now, but could it be that you could actually project a saving to say something like in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, if we carry on in this trajectory, this strategy will result in an X% capturing carbon. I don't know if that's possible. As somebody who practices with it's
theoretically possible, and in the measurement work stream around biodiversity, we will attempt to measure carbon capture. It's a really significant part of what we're doing. Even just mowing improves carbon capture. So where there is data available from academics about the carbon retention potential of different habitats, we'll measure it.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks. So, Sweetbriar Marshes yesterday morning, North Wildlife with yourself, Lord Mayor. No, and obviously marshes, wetlands play a critical role in carbon capture. There's real opportunities for us to work in partnership with the Wildlife Trust to link up with the work the Fringe Project are doing, the Wenson Local Nature Reserve, and to link in with the adjoining sites that we own, Helston Mill Meadow, Helston Road Marsh, in terms of forming that nature corridor along the Wenson Valley into the city, but also providing investment in tackling issues such as invasive species that have become prominent within our marshes, and ensuring that they're in in a fit state to provide the carbon capture we need to address the aims of our broader environmental strategies.
Brilliant, thank you. What I'll do is I'll go quickly down the line to see if anyone has any last comments or questions before probably bringing this to a close. So, Kevin, anything else to add?
No, just again, thank you. It's a really important step. Don't underestimate what
Excellent, absolutely. Councillor Padder? No? Councillor Oliver? Councillor Lubbock?
Yes, just a little bit of explanation on page 12. Under B, the strategy requires alignment of council activity, including reducing interventions in tenants' gardens through changes to the tenancy agreement to achieve cost savings. Examples, please.
At the moment, in our tenancy agreement, the council maintains a right to tidy gardens where they've been left to nature. And so the housing team who are parties to the working groups said, hang on, if a garden is overgrown, then can we just leave it?
That's it in a nutshell.
That's it. So,
I've never known a team to go and clear a garden. They do that, do they? They just can't find rubbish, but they go in and clear a garden.
yes, so if there's vermin or shopping trolleys, etc., then that's something. So it's another really good example where cost saving can be achieved with
Not going in and taking away biodiversity. I'm all for that, but I'm also having a tenancy agreement where they do go in and clear it up of rubbish so that nature can take hold. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Champion?
Yes, please, if I may. Just to follow on that point, one of the things which does concern me sometimes about rewilding is the notion that if we just leave something alone, then suddenly it will become more biodiverse, which isn't always the case, as we are aware. So sometimes non-intervention isn't the best intervention, if that follows. But just in context, and I'm sure you're aware of that. My final point was just in relation where it talks about management and assurance and the biodiversity working group feeding back to the corporate leadership team, portfolio holders and the cabinet as required. I would be keen, as a suggestion, to suggest that the ward councillors in varying wards could maybe meet with said the working group, because I would be very interested, maybe in wards adjoining each other, but to again in relation to education, maybe educating ourselves would be a very good first port of call, and I am not entirely convinced that the entire body of the council is entirely conversant and eco-literate, and so therefore possibly if there would be ways of and that's not as a derogatory term, I mean, myself included, we can all learn, and to encourage us to be working together and collaboratively, because this is bigger than, us, and in a similar way, this is about the citizens of Norwich and about working for the betterment of the planet. So my suggestion would be, as if it's possible for the working group, the biodiversity working group, to meet with different ward councillors in their respective wards to identify areas where they can be encouraging or enhancing biodiversity there. If that sounds like a fair comment.
I think there's lots of opportunities for engagement between work streams in different wards, and ensuring that ward councillors are fully engaged with that in terms of what is going to happen, in terms of what they think should be happening. I think there are lots of ways for engagement between the strategy, between officers and between individual board members.
Is that a no?
No.
Councillor Carley?
No, thank you. Yes, I wanted to flag up the issue of light pollution. which is a big problem for biodiversity, insects and birds. And there are parts of the city at night which are so brightly lit that the birds are singing. And I don't know what can be done about that, but if there's some way of having a different form of lighting at times, that would be helpful. My other point is there's so much going on in relation to councils and biodiversity now. I wonder if it's possible for members to have a briefing at some stage, please. And I don't obviously not going to answer today, but I've got a lot more questions, for example, about the development programme and what some of the suggested tasks will involve. But just to say, yes, not to go, I think that the strategy, I've got some few concerns about aspects of the strategy, but overall the strategy and the development programme I feel can be a real rallying call for everyone in Norwich, and hopefully we will see a step change.
I know we will be moving over to a full LED lighting system. I'm conscious we've still got some more traditional lights on.
Yes, I'm thinking about the station area at night and the post office area, but there might as well be 24-hour daylight there. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Councillor Stutley.
Yes, thank you. Members have mentioned rightly the role of individuals and their gardens and backyards. Quite a lot of things that people can do are cheap and easy. Other things like planting, particularly trees, is not. I wondered, this council is excellent at applying for and gaining funding for various projects. I wondered if you'd identified or can identify anything that will help in that area where individuals can access funding for to help with this project.
As a general response, putting together a funding opportunities register is something that sits with my team as the secretariat. Yeah, we will leave no stone unturned. We're currently looking at an art project, actually, that is looking to plant, I think, 7,000 trees in Norwich, and the Greenhouse Trust, who's leading on that, are, for example, knocking on doors of funds in the city to see if they can facilitate members of the public planting trees, taking photos of their development as part of an art project. So we'll work with our interested partners, strategic partners, to look for those funds where they exist, and we'll be as creative as we can.
Thank you. That sounds very encouraging. Yeah, I'd just like to add my thanks to everybody that's been involved with this. It's a great piece of work. Thank you.
And I'll come quickly to this side. Adam, any last comments?
I don't know, but just to thank all of the officers for all of their fantastic hard work, and really appreciated.
Yeah. And Phil and co, any last comments? Or...
No, thanks for your really constructive input.
Yeah, so to close, just to add my thanks for all the work, and I think I'm really glad there's a consensus about how important this is. We've obviously declared an environmental emergency, but this outlines really well the sort of financial and social benefits for the council and citizens it can bring at the same time as that. Thank you all for your time over the past 2 meetings, and Adam for your presentation and work on driving